Inquiry on Systemic Racist Police Violence Against People of African Descent in the United States. Before we hear from our guest speaker, here's a little bit about Africa Initiative. The Africa Initiative of Syracuse University is a campus-wide project housing the Department of African American Studies with the College of Arts and Sciences, and its purpose is to focus on Africa as an important site of knowledge by highlighting teaching, research, and publication work by Syracuse University scholars in the arts, humanities, social sciences, natural sciences, mathematics, engineering, and others. By providing an alternative vision and platform for constructive discourse on Africa and African peoples, the Africa Initiative is helping alter the dominant perspective of Africa as a continent ridden with perpetual crises and despair. And you can read more about this on Africa Initiative website on Syracuse University Africa Initiative Task Force, kind of, if you go to the website. And today, our guest speaker is Professor Horace Campbell of Syracuse University. Professor Horace Campbell holds a joint professorship in the Department of African American Studies and the Department of Political Science at Syracuse University. He was one of our 4 rapporteurs of the International Commission of Inquiry on Systemic Racist Police Violence Against People of African Descent in the United States. Without further ado, please help me in welcoming Professor Horace Campbell.
Thank you so much, Shukri. And thank you all for coming to this Africa Initiative event. I want to welcome all those who are here for the first time for Africa Initiative. And I see many members of the faculty, and I welcome faculty and students this discussion. I'm hoping that this discussion will be able to strengthen us in understanding the moment that we're in and the tasks ahead of us. I just want to welcome those who are online, and I want to ensure that you can all hear me. Can you? Can you, Austin, hear me?
Hearing you loud and clear.
Good, thank you very much.
Yes.
Thank you. I served as one of the rapporteurs for the International Commission of Inquiry into police violence against people of color, African descent in the United States. The purpose of the Commission of Inquiry was to examine whether widespread and systematic racist violence in policing against people of African descent in the United States has resulted in a continuing patterns of gross and reliable attested violation of human rights and fundamental freedoms. The Commission find a pattern. The Commission find a pattern and practice of racist police violence in the United States in the context of a history of oppression dating back to the extermination of the First Nation peoples, the enslavement of Africans, the militarization of US society, and the continued perpetuation of structural racism. Our work in the Commission has been greatly facilitated by the public outcry, by the work of the families of those who have suffered at the hands of the police. The evolution of this Commission of Inquiry is that the families of George Floyd, Breonna Taylor, Michael Brown, Philando Castile joined 600 human rights groups and petitioned the United Nations Human Rights Council to appoint a UN Commission of Inquiry to investigate systemic racist police violence and the attendant human rights violations against people of African descent. The Human Rights Council of the United Nations directed the Office of the High Commissioner of Human Rights to prepare a report on systemic violence and violations of international human rights by police against Africans and people of African descent throughout the world. that last statement throughout the world was a concession at the Human Rights Council because of the intense lobbying of the United States of America when this report was presented to the Human Rights Council. The report was presented to the Human Rights Council of the United Nations in April. And in April, June, July, the Human Rights Council of the United Nations met and agreed that there would be an investigation into police violence in the United States of America, and that there will be a report. So that is the evolution. This report came out of the activism of the families. And that activism is in the context of a major movement in the United States of America called the Black Lives Matter movement. The challenge for us in our department, when we have a mural on the wall that calls for Black Lives Matter movement, how do we engage this intellectually? In the social sciences, in the humanities, in the sciences, and more importantly, what do we teach students in the law school? I was hoping, and when we invited persons today, that we would be engaging the Black law students all across this country. Because the three organizations that were involved, the National Conference of Black Lawyers and the international, the IADL, these organizations have taken the work of internationalizing police violence against Black people in the United States of America. So after these organizations decided to take up the case, there were 44 cases that were selected. And they were selected on this basis: the killing of unarmed individuals who posed no threat of death or serious bodily harm, the killing of individuals fleeing the police who posed no serious threat of death or serious bodily harm to the officers they were fleeing or others, the use of or threat of use of physical or psychological intimidation to extract confessions, and the maiming of individuals fleeing the police and or who pose no serious threat of death or serious bodily harm to others. So there were 12 commissioners drawn as jurists from all parts of the world. And the findings of the commission inquiry are to be found on the web. The names of the 12 commissioners are also to be found on the web. The commissioners found that there were violations of rights in the United States. Violation of rights to life, security, freedom from torture, freedom from discrimination, mental health, access to remedies for violations, fair trial and presumption of innocence, and to be treated with humanity and respect. Find violations of the state's duty to provide medical care to detained persons, to ensure investigations of extrajudicial killings that are independent, competent, thorough, and effective, and to provide prosecution of suspects and punishment of perpetrators to ensure that perpetrators are held accountable to US laws. And police practices do not comply with international standards for the use of force. It's a major finding of the commission inquiry. the US police practices do not comply with international standards on the use of force, which include legal issues, legitimate objectives, necessary precautions, proportionality, and protection of life, non-discrimination, and accountability. Next one. The findings found a disproportionate use of excessive force by police led to the deaths of the 43 people in the cases they examined. This unlawful disproportionate use of force, including shooting, the use of restraints and tasers. The commissioners find an alarming national pattern of disproportionate use of deadly force, not only by firearms, but also by tasers against people of African descent. The commissioners similarly find a pattern of unlawful and excessive force employed against people of African descent by chokeholds and compression asphyxiation, by kneeling or standing on the victim, by cutting off the victim face down, and by applying pressure to the victim's head and neck. Next one. This case is a case which brought to the world the experience of applying pressure to the victim's head and neck and asphyxiation. The case of George Floyd has now become an international case around the world of identifying police violence. And the brother of George Floyd, Philanese Floyd, has been one of the activists who has been speaking on local and international platforms about the impact of the killing of George Floyd and the killing of Black people. This case is now presented to the United States President, to the Congress, to the United Nations, and in the conclusion, we'll talk about the George Floyd Justice and Policing Act and why there's no movement on that act. And in fact, the movement is in the next direction. So the brother of George Floyd has said what most of the families who spoke before the commission said, that there are two systems of justice in the United States of America. These two systems of justice in the United States of America is one for Black and one for white. And so the commission found that we have to discuss the questions of white supremacy and racial capitalism. And the places that ought to be discussing white supremacy and racial capitalism are retreating. As you know, this week, there was an election in Virginia. And in Virginia, which was one of the strongholds of enslavement in the United States of America, the novel Beloved by Toni Morris was in trial. Because in the popular acclaim of those who have suffered from white supremacy and racist violence, there's a call for atonement, for an honest discussion. And some people believe that that kind of discussion is injurious to them and their families and their children. And so we have a situation now where the fragility of a section of the population, parents are saying it's a threat to the health of our children to discuss white supremacy and racial capitalism. But the Commission of Inquiry agreed. There's been a long-standing scourge of white supremacy and racial capitalism as well as slavery and its legacy in the United States, in which two systems of law exist, one for white people, another for people of African descent. Under the color of law, Black people are targeted, surveilled, brutalized, maimed, and killed by law enforcement officers with impunity, as well as being Black is itself criminalized and devalued. Invariably, when police killing a person of African descent is known to have been unjustified, it is dismissed as merely the action of a few bad apples. This excuse obscures the real problem, however, which is the structural racism embedded in the United States and its legal and policing systems. And this killing of Black people, we now find that there is an entire ecosystem that is not just the police, it is the legal system, the medical practitioners, the universities, the parole system. The entire system is implicated in this system of structural violence. So it is important that we put on the table what is called structural systemic discrimination. That a set of norms, rules, routines, and patterns, attitudes, and standards of behavior that give rise to a situation of inferiority and exclusion of a group of persons in generalized sense. We also have to agree with racial profiling, a tactic adopted for supposed reasons of public safety. I want to underline that word because we'll come back to that in the conclusion. Public safety and protection, motivated by the stereotype based on race, color, ethnicity, language, descent, religion, rationality, nationality, place of birth, or a combination of these factors rather than an objective suspicions, which tends to single out individuals of groups in a discriminatory way based on the erroneous assumption that people with such characteristics are prone to engage in specific types of crimes. So this question of structural racism has been brought to the fore by the Black Lives Matter movement. And so we are in a moment now where the political mobilization for justice for Black people is way ahead of the legal, institutional framework to deal with justice. In fact, what we are seeing today is the society is not willing to come to terms with this. So the mobilization for this, I'm hoping that within the university, we can inspire our students in law, in medicine, in all disciplines to themselves become more human by rising above this dehumanization. So that the mobilization for the inquiry that came from Black Lives Matter, the families, progressive legal communities, and international solidarity. The matter went before the Human Rights Council. The Human Rights Council has now agreed to establish a 3-person investigative team to come to investigate the United States of America police violence. As part of the International Commission inquiry, we are lobbying very hard to ensure that the international investigators into police violence are people who are credible and who would not be bullied by the United States of America. Next. So, How do Black people lose their lives in the United States? The most common is with traffic stops. This week, the New York Times carried out a very long survey about traffic stops. The commissioners find that the rise of force, the use of force against unarmed people of African descent during traffic and investigative stops is driven by racial stereotypes and racial biases, resulting in US law enforcement agencies routinely targeting people of African descent for questioning, arrest, and detention based on racist associations between Blackness and criminality. And in the Black community, you all know what this is called, right? Everybody know what this is called. Yes? Driving while Black. That is the popular understanding of what happens in traffic stops in the United States of America. Next one. We have the case of Sandra Bland. Black woman. Huh?
Say her name.
Say her name. We're going to say many names here today. The case of Sandra Bland. A routine police stop. She was found dead in police custody in Walter County. So more than half the police killings in the United States are not reported in official government data. The medical journal Landsat said that the police killing is actually a health problem in the United States of America. We can go to their findings, which has been published on fatal encounters, mapping police violence. All of these have presented information about the level of police violence in the United States. Next one. And you can see. Yeah. So where does this come from? Where does this stop and frisk come from? What's the genesis of stop and frisk in the United States of America? In the conclusion, we'll come back to this. Stop and frisk. Stopping Black people is the result of the history of slave patrols in the United States of America. Every white person in the history of the United States had the right to stop any Black person, because every Black person was presumed to be a runaway. So the stop and frisk laws in the United States are a direct continuation of the enslavement and the laws relating to Black people and slave patrols in the United States of America. So the police, George Floyd, with Eric Garner, the case of police execution, I can't breathe. I can't breathe. Next slide, please. So the rate of which Black Americans are killed by police is more than twice as high as the rate of white Americans. And one does not need to go to statistics. Every day you speak to people, you hear of this thing in the Black community. Next one. The police has what they call no-knock warrants. No-knock warrants is the police invading Black people's home. You can say this name again. What's the name?
Breonna Taylor.
The no-knock warrant, where Breonna Taylor, promising young woman, killed by police, and no police person was charged. No police person was charged for the killing of Breonna Taylor. The other thing is rough rides by police. Next one. Rough rides by police. Freddie Gray in Baltimore was arrested And instead of providing medical assistance, he was driven around until he was dead. Next slide, please. Now, the cases that were the most difficult for me as a rapporteur in this commission inquiry were the cases of mental health. The cases where the police were called in conditions where people were suffering from mental trauma. I heard the case, a young woman in Queens, New York. She was suffering from a mental breakdown, and the police were called to her home. And in trying to restrain her, the police restraint led to her death. The case of Daniel Prude, for me, that was one of the, because we divided the cases among the 4 rapporteurs and the commissioners. This one was even more difficult. Right here, next door, in Rochester. Daniel Prude, a young man having mental challenges. The family in Chicago sent him to Rochester to be with his brother because of his mental challenges. He was acting up, and his brother called for assistance from the police. 2 o'clock in the morning, Daniel Prude, out in the cold, naked, and killed by the police. And not only that, for 6 months after the killing of Daniel Prude, the police not only covered it up, but refused to reveal the information about the conditions under which Daniel Prude was killed. So the question of mental health and the lethal force that police use against people suffering mental health. So to respond to the public health, it is important to replace militarized police responses with medical responses. And that's what the commission is calling for, a new concept of policing. Next one. The commission found that cis and transgendered women were likely to be raped and violated by the police. Kyla Moore, a transgender woman, was going through a mental breakdown in Berkeley in 2013. She was killed by the police. So we're seeing now that whether it is mental health, whether it is routine police stops, there is, next one, women are not only victims of police brutality, but also sexual violence. Black women. Women are disproportionately affected in the aftermath of police killings as they seek justice for their loved ones. And in light of the economic impact of that killings on family members may have been on the household. Mental illness also plays a disproportionate role in the cases of police brutality and police killings, as well as homelessness. So the social and economic problem of the country we see with the killings of people. The commission found that the police routinely killed Black children. The case of Tamir Rice was a case where a 12-year-old child was killed in Cleveland, Ohio, at the hands of the police, and the police blamed Tamir Rice for his own death. And no one was brought to justice for the killing of Tamir Rice. Then, in the killing of children, there's a traumatization of the families and children. As you know, last year, Jacob Blake was killed in Kenosha, Wisconsin. When Kenosha Blake was killed in Wisconsin, I'm sorry, he was not killed. He was one of the 44 persons, he's the only one who's still alive. But the young children of Jacob Blake witnessed their father being shot and paralyzed by the police. So it's not only the killing, but the traumatization of Black families. Some of you are following the case of one of the vigilantes who drove into Kenosha, Wisconsin, and how this is now a cause célèbre among the right-wing conservative forces in the United States of America. Kyle Rittenhouse case is going before trial. Next one. The commission found that Black immigrants are particularly vulnerable to systemic racial police violence and police killings. I was wanted to play this clip from the mother of Botham Jean. Sorry, they said Botham Jean. Botham Jean was a young man from St. Lucia, an immigrant, was someone who did his accounting degree, a practiced accountant, and his mother went into great detail of how much of a Christian he was. Sitting in his apartment, eating ice cream in Texas. And a young policewoman comes into his apartment, shoots him, kills him, and nothing has happened to her. She has talked about the traumatization of Black families or immigrants. The same thing with Sean Bell. Sean Bell was at a bachelor's party on the eve of his wedding. And the police shot and killed him. Why can the police do this? Next. The police can do this because of a concept in the United States called qualified immunity. Qualified immunity. The commissioners know the lack of independent and impartial review of police killings include the absence of judicial review of prosecutors, virtually unfettered discretion. The commissioners further note that the failure to remedy police misconduct amounts to condoning repeated instances of brutality that ultimately culminate in the use of deadly force. The commissioners find the police defense of qualified immunity amounts to condoning police violence against persons of African descent and creates a culture of impunity whereby offenders are not held accountable and families are left without redress. This is part of US law. Next one. So we have that the police cannot be charged for killing Black people. In the United States of America, qualified immunity is a legal principle that grants government officials performing discretionary functions immunity from civil suits unless the plaintiff shows that the official violated a clearly established statutory or constitutional rights of which a reasonable person would have known. So it is built into the system that if you kill Black people in the United States of America, nothing will happen to you if you're police. And if you're able to get the community behind you, to go to court, and you have good lawyers, then the city will pay millions of dollars because the government now accept that the cost of doing business is will pay our families for killing people. That is the state we are in the Commission of Inquiry in the United States of America. But one cannot look at policing and the militarization of the Black community in the United States in isolation. The militarization of the police is directly related to the global war on terror and policing since the war on drugs in the United States of America. It was Nixon who said very clearly that in order to control the Black community, we will declare a war on drugs to give the police. It was explicit. All of this can be found in the Commission Inquiry. So that since 2001, 20 years ago, under the National Defense Authorization Act, the Pentagon has distributed $5.4 billion worth of military equipment to police agencies since the law was passed a generation ago. Of that amount, $980 million or 18% was disbursed in 2014 alone. What was important in 2014? 2014 was the year of the intensified activity of the Black Lives Matter movement. 2013, Trayvon Martin. 2014, Michael Brown, Eric Garner, and others. So the National Defense Authorization Act, providing more military equipment to the police, was a direct response of the state of people organizing. So the challenge is, what do we do? In the historical section, one of the sections I was responsible for writing, the question is, how do we break the cycle? How do we break the cycle? Throughout the 17th century, the slaveholders successfully convinced the European descended, that is white population as a whole, to participate in the constant controlling of African movements. By the dawn of the 18th century, racialized policing operationalized white racism on a daily basis, maintaining dynamically enhancing both slavery and prejudice. Historians have documented how whites, who all possessed the average right to kill runaway slaves, were not just little kings, but also very big citizens. They were defined as being legitimate inhabitants in the constitutions of independent states. And they so defined in no small part because they were expected or required to award it for and always participate in policing Africans. You will notice that in communities where white people do not want to be white, that they will align themselves against the slave catchers. Syracuse has a tradition, and those of you who have been to Syracuse I've been to Jury Rescue downtown in Syracuse. Their Jury Rescue is an example of the solidarity of white citizens who they acted to stop the capture of Jerry, to return him to slavery. So the question of whiteness that the state seeks to mobilize young people on can be broken. As we studied in the civil rights movement in the 1960s, young whites who joined the civil rights movement stopped being whites once they were part of the civil rights movement. Because once they were part of the civil rights movement, they were no longer whites with the privilege of whiteness because they could be attacked by the police just like any other Black person. So the question is, how do we move to the situation in the United States where we no longer have white people? How do we get to a situation where these people who call themselves white become human beings? I think this is something that the commission raised. Because I am not a trained historian, I delve into a lot of history, but in writing this section, I relied heavily on my colleague, Ed Baptiste in Cornell, who was doing a major book on the question of the history of policing. And Ed Baptiste's book, Half Has Never Been Told, Slavery and the Making of American Capitalism, is an important text that we need to understand. Black people were caught in a nested loop of violence, dehumanization, and systemic exploitation of their labor power. Such violence, dehumanization, exploitation required a precise legal, military, and ideation system. The necessity to police the movement of Black people and to extract wealth from them gradually cemented in the racial divisions in the United States of America. So the police violence that we're talking about, the killing of Black people, is not an accidental matter. It evolved out of the history of policing in the United States of America. Now let me turn to the recommendations. The recommendations of the commission inquiry were addressed to 4 entities. 1, to the Human Rights Commission, the Human Rights Council. The United States left the Human Rights Council under the Trump administration. It has now returned to the Human Rights Council. The findings were addressed to the Human Rights Council of the United Nations. To the High Commissioner for Human Rights, who is Michelle Bachelet from Chile, and she has accepted the challenge to take the matter of the commission of inquiry, and she has already discussed this. In fact, in September 22nd, there was a special session of the General Assembly of the United Nations to discuss these matters. The United States boycotted, along with many other countries. The findings were addressed to the executive branch of the United States and to the United States Congress. So the Commission of Inquiry is making representation to the United States government. Next. The principal finding which the commission found is that there's a prima facie case of crimes against humanity against Black people in the United States of America. That language of crimes against humanity is very specific. And this is now before the Human Rights Council of the United Nations. And therefore, it is calling for the Human Rights Council to refer the United States of America to the International Criminal Court under the Rome Statute. The crimes under the Rome Statute are murder, severe deprivation of physical liberty, torture, persecution of people of African descent, and other inhuman acts, which occurred in the context of widespread systemic attack directly against civilian population of Black people in the United States of America. So the matter is now before the Human Rights Council. Right? So the Constitution of the Human Rights Council calls for the constitution of an independent commission of inquiry mandated to conduct full investigation into incidents of police violence against people of African descent in the United States, in order to establish a continuous process to monitor systemic racist police violence. Is in the Inter-American Human Rights Council and the Human Rights Council of the United Nations. The call for the demilitarization of law enforcement in the United States, and a call for an end to impunity and accountability of the police. So the matter of the police violence is now in the international arena. Unfortunately, the media in the United States is acting as if none of this happened. Next slide. So what's the demand on the executive branch? The demand on the executive branch, the President of the United States, that the International Commission of Inquiry is calling on the United States of America to accept the jurisdiction of the International Criminal Court in relation to US under Article 12 with respect to any or all crimes against humanity as defined in the United States of America. No wonder law schools don't even want to touch this. Judicial Watch and the conservative legal community don't want to touch any of this. The Commission of Inquiry is calling for the United States to sign the Rome Statute and to ratify all other international human rights treaties. Some of you do not know that of the 12 major international human rights treaties, the United States have only signed 3. They have not ratified most of the human rights treaties. Support legislation aimed at divesting federal resources from incarceration and policing, as well as ending criminal legal system driven harms that have disproportionately criminalized Black and brown communities, LGBTQIA people, Indigenous people, and disabled people, and indeed utilizing funding initiatives to invest in new non-punitive and non-carceral approaches to community policing. So the legislative branch. The legislative branch. The Commission of Inquiry is calling for Congress and the Senate to acknowledge that the transatlantic slave trade in African enslavement, colonization, and colonialism were crimes against humanity and are among the major sources of manifestation of racism, racial discrimination, Afrophobia, xenophobia, and related intolerance. Past injustices and crimes against people of African descent in the US must be addressed with reparative justice. That the US Congress should establish a commission to examine enslavement and racial discrimination in the colonies in the United States from 1619 to the present and recommend appropriate remedies. That the US to consider seriously applying the analogous elements contained in the Caribbean communities 10-point action plan for reparations. The popular media do not want that discussion. In fact, as a response to the Black Lives Matter movement, as a response to the 1619 project, we have the contrived discussion in the United States of America on the so-called critical race theory. The other demand that has been made is for the passing of the George Floyd Policing Act. The George Floyd Policing Act is the act which came out of the popular mobilization around George Floyd. The Commission of Inquiry is urging the Congress to pass the George Floyd Policing Act. But what we found is what the United States have done is they do what is called performative legislation. What is performative legislation? That some young man gets killed in Atlanta. The MP in Atlanta, I'm sorry, the congressperson in Atlanta puts a bill before Congress and he goes to the community and says, we have a bill before Congress about the killing of so-and-so. Knowing full well that there will be no law passed in the United States Congress. So in the case of the George Floyd Justice Policing Act, the act is calling for the following: working to end racial and religious profiling, banning no-knock warrants and chokeholds, requiring body cameras on all law enforcement officers, limiting the amount of military equipment transferred to local police departments, enabling the accountability of police officers accused of wrongdoing, investing in better bias training to law enforcement, and improving transparency on police misconduct. What has happened to the George Floyd Justice and Policing Act? Again, performative legislation. It was passed in the Congress and in the Senate, it collapsed. It collapsed. Why did it collapse? It collapsed around the question of how to hold the police accountable. It collapsed around the question of qualified immunity. There was negotiation between the congressman from South Carolina, sorry, the senator from South Carolina and the senator from New Jersey. And there were recriminations, but they had no interest in dealing with the question of qualified immunity in the United States of America. And then the matter which has been most politicized in the United States of America is a matter of the question of public safety. Next slide, please. And so the formula for public safety has been weaponized against the Black Lives Matter movement. Because in the discussions about Black lives, I brought to your attention the example of Daniel Prude in Rochester. What the Black Lives Matter movement is calling for, what the families are calling for, is to say that in the context of people suffering mental trauma, you should not call the police. You should deploy people who are skilled in dealing with people with mental distress. So the media and the conservative forces have taken up the call for restructuring funding of communities and to turn the question of defunding the police into a political question. And now the major, what is called the liberal mainstream media is saying that the progressive and left forces have gone too far in calling for defunding the police. The mothers in Virginia are saying their children are traumatized if they read about enslavement. When their children are traumatized, they do not send police for their children. They send counselors. That's all the Black community is asking for. To say that with budgets, that the police should not be the first point of call. Now in Ithaca, New York, we've had a major advance in Ithaca. In Ithaca, New York, Ithaca is a very progressive community. We've had the mayor has abolished the police department and established a Department of Public Safety. I think one other city in New Jersey have done that. Next slide. So I want to conclude by saying that the Commission of Inquiry is calling for reparative justice. Commission Inquiry is calling for reparative justice. Let's go to the next slide. Next one. That the question of the history of enslavement, Jim Crow, the KKK, police violence, that there must be an agenda in the United States to come to terms with these things. The COVID pandemic has brought these things to the forefront. So we have the demands of the Black Lives Movement. The 6 major demands. Many people talk about Black Lives Matter movement. They've never read the 6 demands of the Black Lives Matter movement. What does it mean for reparative justice? For those of you who do not know the 6 demands, number 1, end the war on Black people. Number 2, reparations. Number 3, invest and divest. Number 4, economic justice. Number 5, community control. And number 6, independent Black political power. The Black Lives Matter movement has registered itself as part of the call for reparative justice. How do we lay the foundations to having full human beings? So this is going to come out of a long, protracted struggle. The struggles for demilitarization, struggles beyond elections. When the commission finished its work, we rolled out the Commission of Inquiry in Kenya, in South Africa, in Nigeria, in the Caribbean, because we're mobilizing the global African community to support this, bringing the United States before the international community. Our task in the university is how do we get young people to spend time doing the kind of intellectual work that will repair them as human beings. Many of the families, they've told us, we want to do more work. We want Black law students in Africa, Black law students in the Caribbean, Black law students in Europe to come together with the Black law students in the United States of America and law students in general to deal with these questions of police violence. So the challenge for us is that the diplomatic efforts, the legal efforts made by the International Commission of Inquiry into police violence, it needs further engagement. And my presenting this as a seminar to you is hoping that we will use these spaces as one way to engage and not to do the silencing that this government wants to do. I will stop there. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Professor Campbell. At this time, we'll be taking questions from the audience as we set up the audio for those online. So if you could please raise your hand if you have a question, and Professor Campbell will address this.
Not waiting for the food. We have a lot of good food out there.
Thank you. Thank you so much.
Okay.
Okay, so we're setting up online. I'll start with my question. It's kind of like a beginner's kind of question. Professor Campbell, why do you think the George Floyd's case specifically was kind of like that entry point for everything else that kind of built up? Because to this point, it's been like the United Nations had over 44 cases with police brutality, but why was George Floyd's the turning point for everything?
Well, I think that the cover-up of the police, because one of the things I did not elaborate on is the entire justice system is complicit. So for example, the medical examiner in the George Floyd case said that he was not killed from asphyxiation. But there are three important aspects of the George Floyd case. The first is that you now have instant documentation that you had a citizen journalist who took the video of the 9 minutes and 19 seconds of the police killing George Floyd. And that citizen activism is someone that fertilized a movement that was already there, the Black Lives Matter movement. The second was the COVID. COVID was a context of deep political and health crisis in the society. And that political and health crisis in the society told people that something is fundamentally wrong, that the government is providing and subsidizing the rich with trillions of dollars. And if you've seen the figures, that during COVID, the rich got richer in the United States of America. So the population was righteously outraged. But the most important was the meticulous and new methods of political organizing by the young people, the Black Lives Matter movement. The Black Lives Matter movement was able to build a truly multiracial, multi-generational, multilingual political movement in the United States of America. And it's become a force in the United States of America. So I think those would be the reasons why, in my estimation, why the George Floyd case became the one that was so widely known.
I think next we'll take a question from someone online. Benji, you have your hands up. And then your question will be next.
Yes, thank you very much. I had to step out. Prof, thank you for the presentation. I hope you can hear me. Well, if you can hear me, I can proceed.
I think he's mute.
No.
Am I clear?
Okay, Benji. Just go ahead.
Okay, if you can hear me, my question is to Prof. I was saying thank you for the presentation, Prof. And I had to step out briefly, but my question relates to the United States and the fact that they have not signed on to the International Criminal Courts. They are not party to it, basically. In other words, they are not signatories. So how can the ICC hold the US responsible for obvious violations of rights of citizens of the United States? How can the court proceed once knowing that the US has not signed on to the ICC as a member country? And secondly, about this report, how would you want the rest of us, I saw someone put in the chat, but how would you want the rest of us to pursue or follow with this report? What do we do right after this presentation? Thank you.
Thank you very much. Well, I believe that the recommendation to take the United States to the International Criminal Court is a recommendation that is valid because the United States does not have to be a signatory to the court for the criminal court to investigate the United States of America. If the reference to the International Criminal Court finds that the United States is guilty of crimes against humanity, then they can have a ruling from the commission has found that the United States is guilty of crimes against humanity. It is calling on the International Criminal Court to find the United States guilty of crimes against humanity. So it is not whether the United States accepts or not. If the United States is guilty of crimes against humanity, it is guilty against crimes against humanity until they indicted in the court of international public opinion. It is already now indicted before the Human Rights Council of the United Nations. The United States acted very, very aggressively to prevent this report being discussed in the Human Rights Council, but they were not successful in their efforts. So the important thing that I would want you to do, Benjamin, is for you to engage the commission report. Understand the findings. There are 7 pages. The report is 188 pages. There are 7 pages where there's the executive summary. I think that apart from the public cases of George Floyd, in every community in the United States of America, in every community, there are outstanding cases of police brutality and police violence. So it means that if you engage the commission report and you use it as a public educational tool, that is, you in your community will not be an accomplice. Last week I was in Rochester. I was visiting another department. And I asked them, what is your department saying or doing about Daniel Prude? The point is, what they want us to do is to be silent. In this community in Syracuse, my wife is just coming from a case in the Somali community of a young person arrested, not having access to due process. In other words, Benji, what I'm talking about in this commission inquiry report is not something that's out there, it's right before your face. You know, the mental health crisis and the police violence against Black people means that we should not be accomplices to this violence. And we are accomplices if we are silent.
Mr. Julian, your question is a bit different. So do you want to read it or do you want us to read it out loud?
You can read it.
Give me a second.
She's muted.
Can you hear us?
Yes. Okay, Marty, can you hear me? Hello, can you hear me?
Yes, we can.
Okay. Thank you very much, Professor Campbell, for a very clear presentation on some very difficult issues that are all very relevant to us. And my concern is that it not stay with this group, but we also look at how we can continue to share and unfold some pattern of dissemination that also leads to action. So, and so basically, I'm very much interested in how do we proceed from here? How do we share this information in ways that are compatible to some of the other struggles that exist today that people are engaged in? But particularly, how do we just get the information out among university students?
Thank you for your question. And I hope everything is okay at home there. Yes?
Yes, it is.
Good. The most limited thing we're asking for is for people to go online, pull up the commission of inquiry and engage it. That's the minimum we are asking, that it's online. The National Conference of Black Lawyers, International Alliance of Democratic Lawyers, and the National Lawyers Guild, they have engaged this report. 3 weeks ago, I was on a conference with the National Lawyers Guild, with lawyers from all over the country, about how law firms can support the work of the Commission of Inquiry and engage. I will say that one of the families who's got a foundation, she said that any student who wants a small grant to go into communities to further this work, they will support. In order, the families, and they're organizing the families, they're working together to popularize, to give information, and to ensure that we stop this police killing in the United States of America. And I would say that individuals should not be silent. I put up a poster of Jews for Democracy, the Jewish community in the United States who say they're against impunity. We want all communities, religious organizations, educational institutions to engage this commission inquiry. So, Sister Julia Lynn, thank you for your question. And one of the reasons I wanted to make this presentation is precisely because we want this thing to be more widely known. Thank you.
I
Yes?
have a question.
question. You mentioned a couple times about mental health
Yes,
and about how we should have like more mental health first aid. My question is about in a lot of communities of color, mental health is very stigmatized, and it's ranging depending on like different places. People either like won't accept it or see it as like see therapy and psychology and stuff like that as like something against culture. How do you suppose we destigmatize the care of people's mental health and viewing it as like a legitimate form of like good practice and like medical practice, so that not only can we have people in like a mental health first aid team, the same way you have like an ambulance or police, but also to have people of color on those teams.
you ask a very profound and fundamental question. Because this is another pandemic in the society that's not recognized. The mental health pandemic. And you're very correct. In many communities, it's stigmatized that people will not seek therapy. But that is part of our own public education. That's part of our work. Every one of us in our families, we're touched by this question. And the extent to which, while we're touched, we move to become educated. We move to become not compassionate, because the United States have a formula. When people get killed, our hearts and prayers. How do we go beyond our hearts and prayers, which is like a formula in the United States for doing nothing. So in our community, we find spaces so we could develop assistance. We should not be too busy. That when people are presented to us in these problems, we are not compassionate and we do not take the time. Because this issue of mental health is the least developed of the medical sciences. It is so underdeveloped because of not only the stigma in communities, the stigma in the society itself. But we have a pandemic of mental breakdown in the society. And the capitalist system is increasing the conditions of mental breakdown in the society. You cannot resolve the issues of mental health in the context of where people are feeling despair. And COVID has only intensified this problem in this society. So yes, it is work. But one of the first ways to deal with it is to take it out of the closet and to put it on the table and discuss it. And we dealt with this. In fact, one of the sections I had to write here was on mental health. And as I told you, there were times when I was a rapporteur listening to the cases that I had to have a double take because it was just too much hearing the cases of what the families were going through. It was not, I feel I'm a strong person, but I nearly broke down more than once in listening to these cases of what happened with mental health.
Just if I can add to the conversation about mental health, in addition to stigmatization, as you said, Professor Campbell, the medical industry or the medical institution is itself complicit because very often when people of color do present with mental health issues, they're misdiagnosed, they're over-medicated, they're likely to lose their children if there are mothers. There are so many stringent consequences that people of color with mental health face that it's at times unlikely that they're going to present if the medical system itself could actually call the police and criminalize Black people who have mental health issues. And this happens like even young children very early on, like from kindergartens or to put on medication and, like put in special classrooms or excluded, treated differently from other kids who have, as you said before, similar issues or concerns.
Thank you very much. I'm sure other people might want to jump in and say something here. It's not just me.
Therese has a question online or a comment, so I'll let you go now, Therese.
Yeah, I'm hearing an echo. Is it just me?
Yeah, it's just you. No.
Okay. So I wanted to put in my 2 cents on the mental health discussion. And to add to what has already been said, I'd like to say that another thing that needs to happen is that there needs to be more BIPOC clinicians in the field. That is a current problem, and I speak both as a woman of color and a clinician. Myself, I am currently a practicing therapist, and it is a serious issue. Persons seeking therapy are often seeking therapy from someone who they think can most closely identify with their presenting problems. And so they are often asking to see someone who looks like them, particularly Black and Brown people. And there is definitely a shortage of Black and Brown people who are practicing therapists and clinicians in general in mental health, not just here in New York State, but I think throughout the United States. And so that is something that would need to be addressed. And also, I think another thing that should be addressed is the fact that we need to start working on what I would refer to as our own brand of therapeutic models. This is not to say that the therapeutic modalities that exist and that we have been using historically do not work. However, I think we're at a stage in the world right now where we need to recognize that cultural communities require very specific attention and care, not just where it comes to their physical health, but to their mental health as well. And that some of the historic therapeutic modalities do not apply to us. And that is just a reality. We often have to kind of tweak and bend them a little bit so that they are more beneficial to people from our cultural community. And I think that that is of course, this is a long-term solution, but it is something that I think definitely needs to be looked into. It is not just a matter of coming into the mental health space and making our presence felt in practice. We also need to touch the theoretical aspects of this work and start rewriting some of the narratives that have existed for centuries regarding mental health and BIPOC communities, so that our work as clinicians with BIPOC communities can be more effective.
Thank you. Well said. In other words, this work affects all of us. Thank you so much. Go ahead.
Thank you, Professor Campbell, for that presentation. It was very illuminating. I have a few questions as well. Firstly,
Could you speak up so they could hear you?
yeah, okay. Firstly, about just widening this conversation to with the population, and having more people engage in this discussion. So my first question would be, then how do we kind of take this to the Syracuse community, as Syracuse University, as a department of AAS, how do we engage the community in this conversation? Because I was just thinking, like, my neighbors around where I live that would be very interested and very impacted by this conversation, even if it's just joining via Zoom or whatever. How do we kind of bring this, discussion about the Commission of Inquiry to the larger population who might also be interested in learning about this? My next question is about what you said about engaging global Africa in this conversation, in demanding colonialism to be recognized as a crime against humanity, and how Black Lives Matter has kind of gone beyond the borders of America, Europe, Africa, and even in African descendant communities where they're not experiencing, where they don't have a history of slavery, they still recognize police brutality, which, is still from the same systems. So how do we kind of reinforce this movement and reinforce this solidarity in the Caribbean and Africa for this inquiry, this commission inquiry to go forward and also to address the problems of these people as well?
Thank you. I should turn the question back to you. Because, that is why we're having this seminar. We were going to have this seminar on the International Commission of Inquiry. Mahi said, we have to talk about the International Commission of Inquiry to police violence in the United States of America. The commissioners are very engaged. The 12 commissioners from the Caribbean, from Pakistan, South Africa, Costa Rica, England, France. The international commissioners have been very active. Right now, we're working with the International University of Peace in Costa Rica to see how the United Nations could take it beyond the Human Rights Council. But I think we should bear in mind that this is not, we present this commission of inquiry. The media has been very silent about it. The media, I think Newsweek and Time Magazine reported. The mainstream Washington Post, New York Times, the mainstream media acts as if this commission of inquiry did not exist. So what we are trying to do is to say police violence against Black people in the United States is not a myth. What the United States has said, and the attitude in the United States of America, is that police killing of Black people is the action of a few bad apples. That is, there are few individuals who are misguided, like Derek Chauvin, who are bad apples. So the language of bad apples is different from systemic racist violence. And I think this is the challenge, because in the university now, the university do not want to talk about racism. They now talk about diversity, inclusion, and equity. And we say to the university, we want diversity, we want inclusion, we want equity, but we also want to discuss systemic racism. In Texas, this is the new variety of ice cream now, diversity and inclusion. In Texas, there's a hospital who employed a Black doctor to be the chief diversity officer. Before he could take up his job, he was fired because he said that as the chief diversity officer, we must discuss racism. He says, you're not a good fit for the job. Because when you're talking about diversity and inclusion, you should not talk about racism. There is a blowback against the 1619 Project. Even some members of what is called the progressive left say that this is a diversion from the white working class, that you're making the white working class feel uncomfortable. The German Nazis they've come to grips with the crimes of Nazi Germany. The Germans are not afraid to speak about the Holocaust against the Jewish people because the society has accepted that they committed a crime. But if the United States does not accept that crimes were committed in genocide, in enslavement, in crimes, then these crimes will continue. And what we are having now is a political movement which is growing on the basis that you cannot talk about these things. So, yes, I believe that the work that I would like to see in the larger population begins with you. Please, when you go home, download the commission inquiry. Send it to every one of your friends. Okay, that is what I'm asking you to do. Now, the other thing the United States does with the war on terror is it seeks to export its method of policing and its method of racial profiling. So inbuilt in the United States Africa Command or United States assistance to other countries is packaged the ideas about policing in the United States and attitude to Black people. And the same thing the police does here, they do in Africa. Members of the United States Special Command in Mali, they killed a Black man who was in the US Army in Mali. They tried to cover it up. They released them, and when they came back to the United States, they went to the wife of the soldier who was killed to intimidate his family. So the US military police apparatus are very much interwoven in this thing about police brutality. But we are diverted from it because the United States is fighting terrorism in Africa. And we're giving assistance to fight terrorism. So we ourselves have to elevate ourselves above this information warfare to deceive us about what's going on. I hope that answers your question. We take two more because I think people are getting hungry.
I guess this could be like a short comment. So I've heard several persons ask basically, what do you do after this meeting?
After this meeting today.
Right, after this meeting today with this information. And I've also heard people basically mention that practices like, what do you bring it out into the wider community and so on. And we kind of mentioned it in our conversation today, but we haven't really delved much into it, which I think is a big part of like the Black Lives Matter movement, which is the role of social media. And I think as young people here, we know what the power of that is. And I think just for me, like while I was listening to the presentation, I'm thinking about what am I going to do afterwards. My immediate thought was we start social media, which is something we do so easily and so naturally for simple things. We go on Instagram, we go on Facebook, we go on TikTok, and we share things without thinking twice. We're just swiping, clicking likes. So for me, it's like you easily see as a young person on social media platforms how easily information can spread in a matter of 1 hour and go to millions and millions of people across the world. So for me, one of the easiest steps would be, find the document and share it. Share it on your social media platform. And many of us have links across the world because of social media. That's the easiest way. And people are using like TikTok, for example, which I love because I think TikTok is such a strong platform in the sense that now you're seeing like so many different cultural backgrounds and from different places using a short space of time to share like powerful information. And it's not just young people doing dances and fun stuff. The algorithms give you sides of, for example, TikTok, where you can see stuff on like medical information or religious information or information on politics. And so a lot of young people are gaining information, not from the traditional media, but from social media. And so I guess my point here is the Black Lives Matter movement spread largely because of hashtags. So why not begin there with sharing this document and then move forward? And then if you're in, all of us here are attached to various disciplines. And so for me, one other thing is to also think about activism, not just in this strategic way that, or this standard way that we always see with, going on the streets and holding up placards, but think about the discipline that you're in and how can you contribute in your discipline. So if you're in media, for example, if you're attached to Newhouse and you're in media, find a way to engage that in your classrooms. Find a way, if you're a grad student, how to get that out. If you are in African American studies and you're in history, find a way to engage that historically. If you are in literature, like I'm a literary person and I'm reading novels, how do I link historical events to the text I'm studying? So you have to find a way to link the information you're learning to your own discipline and do it in that way. And if you're also a person who's engaged in like activism outside of academic spaces, like you volunteer, find ways to put that in. When things matter to you, you'll find avenues to get it out. So I don't think the question is that difficult to answer, because when you find information that you find fun or enjoyable, you find a way to share it. So it's the same kind of concept and energy that we have to put into this information, how to get it outside of this room.
Thank you so much, Nadia. Thank you so much. I think that is the point, that the report of the Commission of Inquiry should not be just a document among lawyers and students, that it should be an active document, that people talk about George Floyd. Not many people talk about Daniel Prude or about Sean Bell. And for me, the case of Daniel Prude is the one that got to me more than any of the other cases. Covered it with a hoodie over his head and killed naked at 2 o'clock in the morning in freezing rain. So I think that our task is that we will become human. We will ourselves become less carried away by the frivolities of this. So thank you very much, Nadia. And you're correct. Black Lives Matter is not for people in literature or law or humanities. Because when they're teaching you about public media and public diplomacy, what the United States does not want is for this to be in the public media. That's why people say her name. Sandra Bland, say her name. Okay, we'll take 2 more or we can go to eat.
I think Therese has her hands up, so let's just take her and then.
Yeah, I was going to say that I feel a little, I don't know, some type of way because of how silent this event is on the SU campus today. You know, in the spirit of brightening the corner where you are and charity begins at home and all of those things, why is there not more noise on this campus around this report? Like, why are we sitting here discussing how we are going to get people to see this? And what can we possibly do to get this into the hands of as many students as possible when we are sitting on a university campus? Like, for me, that is something to think about. Why isn't the Africa initiative being spoken about more? Why is everything around this so quiet? And these are rhetorical questions, or Dr. Campbell can answer them, but I'm just thinking out loud and saying that that is something that absolutely has to change.
Thank you, Therese. I agree.
Dr. Campbell, anybody else want to respond?
Well, I know your question is rhetorical, but I think partly to why this isn't being discussed is because there are so many efforts on campus in terms of diversity and inclusion. And there's a lot of like fractured organizing of these issues happening in different departments. But they're like in little niche groups where, for example, the African Initiative is under AAS. So possibly a report like this will only be heard by students in AAS or within the network. And so I think it's structural. and goes back to questions of how we view racism versus diversity or discrimination and how we address it on campus. We see a lot of efforts like BIPOC this, BIPOC that, some that I myself am a part of, but are not willing to engage this material. So one of the things Africa Initiative this semester has been trying to do is force these issues to be out here and to be discussed, because one, our turnout has shown that there is interest. Students want to talk about these things. Faculty wants to address these things. And two, there is a systematic kind of way of silencing these things and instead turning them into, you know, what can Black students do together, like for fun, instead of like, let's talk about these real issues, like Syracuse itself is in the heart of a very poor community, a very exploited, oppressed community. So I hope that engages with your rhetorical questions for that.
Therese, let me say that I was teaching in the middle of this report and I was consumed by this work. We had meetings 3 or 4 times a week and we had to write this report in about 7 days. It was a test of all of my training. And I was working with 3 other women who were lawyers, and I could tell you that they were just such superhuman beings in terms of the work that went into this report. Now, in the university, once this report was concluded, I thought that I would send it and share it with my colleagues in law, in Newhouse, in Maxwell, and I did. I sent out emails. It's like there's a conspiracy of silence. They don't want to hear. In the university celebrates faculty that do work that have international significance. I gave it to my head of department. I wanted the Faculty of Arts to acknowledge that there was such a report and their faculty was part of a major international commission card. No. That's not the kind of thing that we want to celebrate or to talk about. So I believe that this work has to be slow, has to be patient, has to be pedantic, and it's not flashy. There are no rewards for this work. In other words, people come out because of George Floyd, but Sean Bell, Botham John, Sharice, all of these names, we can say their names. And for me, these people are like family now. Because I heard the cry of the mothers, because the police go out of the way to brutalize Black community because many of the killings are done in broad daylight to intimidate the community. So I hear you, Sharice. I heard you, Sharice, but I will welcome an invitation to Falk College and to the therapist in Falk College, and I will make myself available to make a presentation in Falk College. So thank you for that intervention.
I will go over to Falk and make some noise on your behalf, sir. It will be my pleasure.
Do we have any more questions? Thank you all for coming. We hope you stay around and stick around for some food. We have a lot of food here. I'd like to thank everybody from Africa Initiative, those who helped plan the event today, those from Africa Initiative Board, Dr. Smith, Professor Campbell, those online. There are a couple of board members online. So thank you. And everybody here, thank you all for attending, and we hope you continue to spread news about Africa Initiative and also about the report, and continue to engage with the African American Department as well. Thank you all.
Thank you all for coming and for supporting the work of Africa Initiative.
We were concentrating on flight mentality earlier.